Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Breakpoint is, I think, the second worst game I've played all year after Anthem, at least for a AAA title anyway. The latest in the long-running Tom Clancy video game franchise developed by Ubisoft Paris, it's a game with just a whole heap of problems and it should have been so much better. Not sure if it wants to be some kind of hardcore survival shooter or a more wacky, zany open world shooter like Just Cause or Grand Theft Auto. Breakpoint sits somewhere in the middle, offering up a disjointed campaign that has no flow, throwing you into a gigantic, lifeless world and pitting you up against brain-dead enemies whose difficulty is represented by a number above their head, instead of, actual intelligence. You can play the whole thing solo, which makes the most sense considering the premise, or invite a mate along to experience the whole thing with you. All of this combined with microtransactions that allow people to bypass the entire progression system.
It's time to start talking to me.
Taking place on Auroa, which is a generic-looking island in the middle of the ocean, this is the home of Skell Tech, run by a billionaire named Jace Skell. And the island has become home for the employees of Skell Tech, along with being the place where they produce all of their military tech. When the PMC group they've hired to protect them goes rogue is when it all goes to hell and the entire island falls under martial law. The antagonist is Cole Walker, played by Jon Bernthal from The Walking Dead and The Punisher, and this guy is just criminally underused here. Maybe he doesn't show up all that much because it was expensive to use him or something, but his appearances in the game are fleeting at best, and the few flashbacks we do get don't use this guy to the best of his abilities. Walker's leading a group of elite soldiers called the Wolves, which are supposed to be the best of the best, and the opening sequences set it up as if this is some kind of super tough force you're gonna come up against. So the CIA sends a Ghost Recon unit in to investigate, which is where you come in. And you've got to explore the island and uncover what's happened, along with finding out Walker's motives. As it also turns out, he's got personal ties with the main character.
You fucking worm.
So you'll team up with former Skell employees along with other survivors in a mountain base called Auroa, which is a hideout that's so obvious that it's amazing how an island teeming with murderous drones hasn't found it. I mean, the people that reside there are stupid enough to park helicopters and motorbikes at the front door. And this kind of brings up my first issue with the game, is just how the writing and the cinematics seem really sloppy and unpolished.
Sure.
A lot of the cinematics are missing basic sound design. There's no music, no background noise, and people just kind of stand around delivering dialogue in a very drab way. The voice acting in some of these is downright amateurish, with really crappy performances and some lines of dialogue almost being inaudible. About the only one doing a good job is Bernthal. I mean, at least it sounds like he's trying to put an effort into it. Everyone else just sounds bored, and visually too, he's the only character that looks remotely interesting. All of these side characters look like the type of people you'd see at a TED Talk. Now, on a positive note, the island of Auroa is pretty big. And right from the get-go, pretty much if you can see something, you can reach it. Like, see those mountains over there? You can climb those. There is a definite sense of freedom in that regard, and just going off and doing your own thing can be fun, for a time anyway. Now, you've got 4 classes to choose from. You've got Field Medic, Assault, Panther, and Sharpshooter. All classes get access to the same weapons, they've just got different buffs and unique gear and challenges to complete. So the Field Medic's got a medkit that can buff allies by giving them an extra health bar, and then a drone that can revive downed players. The Assault class comes with a gas grenade and an ability where damage resistance is increased and kills refill your health. The Panther's your stealth class, which makes sneaking around a lot easier, and this one's got some kind of magic spray that makes you invisible to drones, and an ability that lets you vanish from enemy sight for a short period, which is useful for retreating. Then the Sharpshooter is your sniper class. This one's ability is called Armor Buster, where you load in a bunch of more powerful armor-piercing rounds. But I think more importantly, and probably one of the most useful items in the game, is this little pulse thing you can shoot out, which highlights and tags all of the enemies in the area. Each class then has its own set of challenges too, like killing a certain amount of enemies with sniper rifles, or killing a certain amount of enemies with an assault rifle. So it kind of gives you a bit of incentive to try out each of these and earn extra skill points. Yeah, skill points, because Breakpoint is supposedly an RPG. So you earn XP from kills and completing missions, and every time you level up you get to spend your skill points on some kind of upgrade for your character. But unlocked skills carry across to each class and you can swap between classes easily anyway. And by the end of the campaign, you'll have unlocked every single skill point. It's once you head off into the game world though and start to tackle the main missions where the monotony starts to set in. You see, almost every mission in the game follows a pretty similar pattern. So you head off to the mission area, which is always swarming with bad guys, so you gotta drone it out to get a rough idea of how many enemies are around. After that, you have to sneak in and get some kind of information to your next objective, which almost always just involves finding some piece of intel, or interrogating NPCs for information like your Sam Fisher or something.
Surprise, shitbag.
After this is done, it'll often send you to another location to do it all over again. Usually after doing this 2 or 3 times, the last location is the one you need, and this is where the mission is going to often end. Some missions require you to kill some kind of named NPC, usually a high-ranking member of the Wolves, which you'd think would result in some kind of boss fight. But nah, you just cap these guys in the head like they're your average grunt. Then the game's going to make you fast travel to the other side of the planet to hand the mission in.
Surprise, shitbag.
Once you've done 2 or 3 missions, you've already seen how pretty much the remainder of the missions are going to work, and it becomes super boring super quickly. Along the way, you open up every single chest you can find, because the core gameplay loop is about constantly incrementally upgrading all of your equipment, to add an extra point or 2 to your aggregate gear score. Every single assault rifle, pistol, helmet, or pair of boots you come across has a number attached to it, along with some other basic stats, and you can't take on certain missions or attack certain enemies until your gear score is at a certain point. And all of this gear works like standard RPG loot, with uncommons, rare, epics, and legendaries. But that's kind of the thing, is that you're not really playing a campaign in this. You are moving through a series of preset missions, but really you're just grinding out your player's gear score, so it's high enough to take on the final boss. The game suggests that for the final mission, your gear score needs to be 150. But I've seen videos on YouTube of people doing the final boss fight around 90, so it seems like it means jack shit. And most guns seem to kill enemies in a single headshot anyway. This whole gear system kind of reminds me a lot of Anthem, how you'll just keep seeing the same looking guns over and over, and all that differentiates them is a number. An MP7 you'll find at level 5 is going to be the same as one you'll find at level 35. It's just going to be thrown through a different RNG machine along the way to predetermine what its stats are. I mean, you're not going to find some kind of rare, unique assault rifle with its own unique skin and attachments. An AK-47 is always going to look the same. Loot has no real long-term value either because you're replacing stuff so often. At one point I found a legendary headpiece which had some decent stats, but then 5 minutes later I found another headpiece that was superior. Once you find a blueprint for a weapon, you can craft it whenever you want off a specific NPC that you find at Auroa. And this is always going to be a weapon at your current level, so basically you can just buy an always updated version of your current gun whenever you want. You can even just keep rebuying the same gun until it generates a really high quality one. Or maybe you could just spend real dollary dues and unlock everything from the get-go. Yeah, Breakpoint has some downright egregious microtransactions. You can literally buy every single gun, blueprint, attachment, and so on with real money. Ubisoft should have known better too, man. I mean, in 2019, adding microtransactions of any kind into your game is kind of like throwing a bucket of oily piss onto a dumpster fire. Remember how in RPGs that are actually good, how you'd find some kind of chest at the end of a super hard dungeon, and so the value and accomplishment of finding that chest actually meant something? Yeah, remember that? Well, you won't feel that here. Off the back of that too, upgrading weapons is kind of pointless because again, chances are you won't be sticking to one weapon for all that long. There are definite benefits to upgrading guns, giving them better accuracy, mobility, and damage, but until the endgame, it seems like a pointless mechanic and a bit of a waste of resources. There's no non-lethal weapons either, so you're just going around turning the island into a goddamn cemetery, killing every single person you see because I'm sure they're all bad people that deserve to die. We'll never know though, will we? Because it's something that the story just never explores. You know what else I'm sick of? Is this same rehashed enemy list we've had a bazillion times now. You know what I mean? I feel like we've had this in every single shooter over the last decade. You've got your standard enemy, you've got the sniper, you've got the heavy armored type, you've got the guy with the shotgun, and then some guy with explosives. It's just been done. Even the wolves, as badass as they're supposed to be, are just guys with a little bit more armor than your standard grunt. The only enemies I died to were the drones, mostly because of how they zip around to make it artificially more difficult to hit them. Yeah, good luck trying to shoot these things if you're playing with a controller. And some of the larger tanks can be a bit of a handful because some of their attacks can just schwack you in a matter of hits. Later on in the game, you'll take on these bigger, tougher drones which require explosives to reveal their weak points. But even though they've got a lot more health points, once you figure out how to beat these things, the strategy never changes. These are definitely easier in co-op mode, just so that the behemoth has something else to shoot at aside from you. Though at least they do offer up something remotely resembling a challenge. But otherwise, the AI in general is just laughably bad. Enemies will often just stand in one place, just begging to be put out of their misery, and it's kinda sad. This can be played as a stealth game, but despite your best efforts, you'll almost always get into combat, or at least have enemies in an alerted state. There is some neat stealth mechanics though. When you go prone, you can cover yourself in dirt or snow to become invisible to enemies. But sooner or later, you're gonna get into a gunfight. Breakpoint lacks a snap to cover button, which is kind of annoying, but otherwise the combat ain't bad, it just lacks any kind of challenge. Enemies will often just run right towards you in droves, begging to be shot in the face. That's if they're not just standing somewhere else doing nothing. Literally nothing. It's kind of odd too because Ubisoft games generally have some pretty decent enemy AI. I mean, the bad guys in The Division 2 were super aggressive and they didn't waste time in flanking you or flushing you out of your position with grenades. Here they might rush your position occasionally, but mostly they'll just run around for a bit before finding a tree or a wall to hide behind. Some areas are cordoned off by the wolves, and like I said, you think maybe the wolves are going to be a bit tougher. But no, they're just the same as the other enemies, except slightly more aggressive. And they still go down with a single headshot like the rest of them do. And like your standard enemy types, they ain't all that bright either. Like, check out this guy here, who just watched his buddy get murdered. What does he do? He just stands there.
What the fuck?
One of the game's new features is the bivouac, which is Breakpoint's way of introducing fast travel points. Now, these in concept are pretty cool. There's dozens of these scattered across the map you'll need to unlock. And once you've found one, you can use it to remove fatigue, which limits your stamina bar. You can create rations, which will give you benefits like increased stamina and accuracy. You can also give yourself 60-minute long buffs. You can also give yourself a single 60-minute long buff, like 10% extra experience points by jotting shit down in a notepad, or 20% extra stamina by lightly cracking your neck back and forth because, yeah, that makes sense. But the bivouac also feels like the mechanic out of a mobile game, because aside from all that aforementioned stuff, you can also buy guns and armor, as well as refill all of your equipment. You can also spawn in motorbikes, cars, and goddamn combat choppers. Don't ask me how that works, but that's what happens. I mean, maybe your bivouac's connected to some kind of high-tech 3D printer or something. And this was the biggest shock I had with Breakpoint, because it really got advertised as being this fight for your life behind enemy lines kind of shooter. I thought I'd have to scavenge for supplies. I'd have to bandage major injuries and flee from combat with a broken leg. But it's all just a bit of a ploy, because you've got these magical fast travel stations that work like a 7-Eleven. And you've got a magical healing syringe that restores all of your health points in a single hit. The only time in the entire game I had to bandage myself was during the prologue when the game forced me to do it. If you run around too much, your stamina can run out and you're supposed to refill it by drinking from your water canteen. Something else I didn't need to do a single time in my entire playthrough. And this was even on the so-called advanced difficulty setting. It just played like a standard third-person shooter. This whole fight for survival thing was just a bit of a marketing trick. About all you're going to be fighting is gravity, because of the new sliding mechanic, where you often lose control of your character when trying to move down any kind of steep terrain. Oh man, this sliding mechanic is just so annoying. Yeah, it's so much fun watching your character lose control on a hill and tumble down it like an absolute idiot. Reminds me of that scene from Black Sheep with Chris Farley. And it annoys me even more because it never affects the enemies. Like, look at this big fat asshole here, covered in body armor, somehow perfectly maintaining his balance. If I was standing there, I'd roll down that hill so quickly, I'd end up in another hemisphere by the time I landed. Aside from all of this, there's just so many things I'd honestly say I hated about Breakpoint. Yeah, I hate it.
I'm still working that out.
I hate the game engine's way of trying to replicate dark areas, with this kind of faux HDR effect which just makes dimly lit areas impossible to see in. I hated how every single gadget in the game is bound to the same button. You've got flashbangs, grenades, rocket launchers, lures to distract enemies. You can even send out a bunch of little sniper drones and synchronize them to take out 4 enemies at once. There's a whole bunch of these, and this is all fine and dandy. But the problem is that these are all bound to the same button by default. To select the item you want, you have to bring up an item wheel and then select it. And it's just an incredibly clunky way of swapping between items. Like swapping from grenades to a healing syringe during combat, for instance, is not a particularly seamless transition. The controls are so bad that they've even included 74 separate control hints during the loading screens. 74 hints. And you'll probably have time to read these considering how long the loading times are. I hate how selling and dismantling items has to be done for every single item. There's no bulk sell or bulk dismantle feature like in The Division 2. So have fun sitting there for 5 minutes dismantling everything you've hoarded away. I also hate how there's no memorable music. I couldn't recall a single music track that I thought was good. In fact, sometimes there's a complete absence of music entirely. Then there's all of the bugs. Now this could be simple things like textures not loading in quickly enough. Or this lady having her hair in the cinematic for a few seconds. Could be seeing someone clipping through a wall, or seeing it rain inside a helicopter. By the way, these three all happened in the same mission. Every single time I loaded into the game, it would keep saying that I just finished the tutorial mission even after 25 hours of playing. There's weird and broken physics with vehicles, animation glitches, and NPCs often won't show up when you're trying to turn in missions. Even something trivial like your stamina bar not showing up when you're sprinting or sliding. Now Breakpoint is a pretty good looking game too, but to the surprise of absolutely no one, it runs like shit. And even when I ran the game on the lowest settings, it still stuttered and chugged along. And it's a bit of a shame because in a shooting game, it makes aiming really tricky when your frame rate is so jittery. I mean, for the final boss fight in the game, I think I was getting 15 to 20 frames per second. But mostly it's a shame because it really is a gorgeous looking game at times. The backdrop of the island, as generic as it is, still looks very appealing. Moving through the bushes at sunrise or sunset, or just witnessing one of those cool time lapses when you leave the bivouac is impressive, but it's ruined by shoddy performance, yet again. All up, finishing the main missions took me about 25 hours, and I was pretty much just focusing on those alone, ignoring most of the side missions. I spent a few of those hours playing with a mate in the co-op mode, but that didn't really improve things all that much, it just meant that we got to share in each other's misery. I did unlock a lot of the bivouacs and spend a fair bit of time crafting weapons, so there is a lot of content here, even if it is extremely repetitive. There's also faction missions, you can take down convoys for extra gear, destroy all the super tough behemoth drones, or clear the wolves outposts. Or if you're sick of PvE, there's always the PvP mode as well. This is 4v4 combat on smaller sized maps, where everyone's gear and levels are balanced out.
You're the last one alive.
Overall, I think the PvP is okay. The shooting works quite well, and the performance is a lot better than PvE because of how much smaller the environments are. But I can't see myself spending any serious time with this, and after playing it for a couple of hours, I was already getting bored. I think I'll stick with Rainbow Six Siege.
Enemies down. Only one hostile left standing.
At some point in the future, Ubisoft is also going to be adding in the raids. The current one is supposed to be out soon, I think, with future updates bringing more raids. I don't know if these future raids will have a price tag on them, but if Ubisoft's history with DLC is any indicator, well, I'd say that's a yes. I guess my biggest takeaway here is that Breakpoint is just unfinished. It feels rushed and unrefined. There's far too many problems with it to be called polished, but the core gameplay just isn't very enjoyable, and the gameplay loop is monotonous. The fact that it's set on some made-up island as compared to Wildlands being set in Bolivia means it also lacks any real personality or character. It just feels like an environment made up of stock library assets. When you've got an underdeveloped villain and an underwhelming enemy force, it just makes the whole thing feel so pointless and trivial. We're only ever told that Walker and his wolves are a threat. It's never shown or felt through the player's perspective.
Glad that you're still above ground.
His reasons for reaching his breaking point, hence the title, are cliche and not all that much of a revelation, nor do they justify his actions. And I feel like I'm only scratching the surface, but at this point I just feel like I'm rubbing salt into an already gaping wound.
Surprise, shitbag.
The whole point of the video is, would I recommend Breakpoint? And the answer is no. This kind of thing just doesn't cut it. If they're going to have another stab at this Ghost Recon thing, I think Ubisoft need to take a good hard look at what they're doing wrong and try to fix it. And please, for your own sake, next time, don't include microtransactions.